My fiancée traded me for a wealthier man her parents handpicked. She dropped my handmade promise ring into my coffee cup. You're a joke, keep your cheap wire. 3 years later, she's having a meltdown after watching me succeed with my massive franchise and my absolute soulmate. We lived in a cramped, drafty studio apartment above a noisy laundromat on the east side of Portland. The floorboards vibrated from 6 a.m. to midnight, a constant dull hum of washing machines on the spin cycle. The air always smelled faintly of bleach and cheap dryer sheets. I was working double shifts as a prep cook at a mid-tier steakhouse downtown, pulling 14-hour days, chopping onions until my hands were calloused, and my clothes permanently reeked of stale grease and garlic. I was saving every spare cent, hoarding cash in a shoebox in our closet, to start my own upscale food truck. Natalie used to tell me she believed in me. She used to sit on our beat-up futon, drinking cheap wine, listening to me talk about menu concepts and overhead costs. When I proposed, I didn't have the money for a diamond. I took a piece of raw, unpolished quartz I found on a hiking trip we took for our first anniversary, and I spent 3 weeks secretly learning how to forge and twist copper wire to hold it. When I slid it onto her finger, she wept. She swore it was perfect. She took photos of it in the sunlight, posted them online with long captions about authenticity and true love. But behind closed doors, her family treated me like a stray dog she'd dragged in from the rain. Her father, Stellan, was a corporate real estate broker. Her mother, Blythe, came from old money that had slowly thinned out, leaving behind nothing but the snobbery. At holiday dinners, I was seated at the far end of the table. Her uncle Thad would drink 2 glasses of scotch and casually ask if I planned on smelling like a deep fryer for the rest of my life. I was always their designated punchline, and Natalie, who defended me fiercely in our drafty apartment, always went quiet in their dining room. She would stare down at her plate, swirling her wine, letting the jokes land. The turning point was a 4th of July family retreat in Lake Tahoe. Stellan had rented a massive, glass-fronted cabin right on the water. I had to beg my manager for the weekend off, nearly losing my job in the process. When we arrived, the driveway wasn't just filled with Stellan's SUVs. There was a pristine, slate-gray Porsche 911 parked near the entrance. Her parents had deliberately invited Dominic. He was 32, a venture capitalist who spoke in buzzwords and wore loafers without socks. He had the kind of aggressive, unearned confidence that only comes from inherited wealth. The entire weekend, Natalie shadowed him. She laughed at all his jokes. She drank the champagne he brought. We were sitting on the expansive wooden deck overlooking the water when Stellan brought up my food truck idea, just to serve me up to the room. Dominic swirled his drink and looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. A food truck. Right, that's a cute concept. Peasant food for the late-night crowd. I guess someone has to feed the drunks. I waited for Natalie to say something. I waited for her to tell them about the margins I'd calculated, the hyper-niche menu I'd designed. Instead, she laughed loudly. She rested her hand playfully on Dominic's knee. I sat in stunned silence. The ice clinked in Dominic's glass. I looked at the copper wire ring on Natalie's hand, resting against Dominic's expensive linen trousers. It looked cheap. For the first time, I saw it exactly the way they did. 2 weeks later, the sky opened up over Portland. It was a torrential, miserable downpour. I had just finished a brutal shift and was hauling 2 bags of trash out to the alley behind the diner. Natalie was standing there under a large black umbrella. Beside her was a trash bag stuffed with my clothes. She didn't ease into it. She didn't cry. I need a man with a real financial portfolio, she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain hitting the dumpsters. Not a guy who smells like bleach and beef stock. I stood there in my stained apron. I held a plastic cup of lukewarm diner coffee in my hand. We're getting married, I said. It sounded pathetic even to me. She reached into her pocket, pulled off the handmade copper ring, and dropped it directly into my coffee cup. It made a hollow, sickening splash. You're 28, playing chef. Dominic just bought a vacation home in Aspen. He doesn't scrape dimes to take me out. You're a joke. Keep your cheap wire. So you were just killing time? I asked, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead. Dominic is flying me to Cabo, she replied. She turned and walked toward the end of the alley, where a black SUV was idling, its taillights bleeding red into the wet pavement. The next day, my business loan for the food truck was formally denied. The loan officer at the regional bank, a tired-looking man named Arlo Trask, wouldn't even look me in the eye when he handed back my paperwork. I was entirely broke. I had no apartment. I slept on a friend's couch and took a second job catering private yacht parties up in Seattle just to survive. 6 months after the breakup, I was working a corporate mixer on a 3-tier luxury yacht in Seattle Harbor. I was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting tuxedo, holding a silver tray of miniature crab cake. The boat swayed gently. I turned a corner near the starboard bar and locked eyes with Natalie. She was wearing a silk dress that cost more than I made in 6 months. Dominic was standing beside her, holding a cigar. When he saw me, a slow, greasy smirk spread across his face. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, took 2 crab cakes off my tray, and fished a crumpled $5 bill out of his pocket. He dropped it onto the silver tray. Keep the change, sport, he sneered. Natalie giggled. She looked away, pretending to be fascinated by the Seattle skyline. She wouldn't look at my face. That crumpled $5 bill sat on my tray for the rest of the night. When I got back to the cramped room I was renting, I smoothed it out on the desk. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, absolute clarity. I didn't want a food truck anymore. I wanted an empire. I maxed out 3 credit cards. I stopped sleeping. I leased a windowless ghost kitchen in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. I pivoted away from street food and launched a hyper-niche meal prep service tailored entirely for professional athletes recovering from injuries. High-protein, anti-inflammatory, macro-perfect meals. No storefront, no walk-ins, just relentless, aggressive networking at elite training facilities and private gym. I practically lived in my car. I handed out samples to trainers, physical therapists, and sports agents. I was annoying. I was undeniable. 9 months in, a defensive lineman named Caden Locke tore his ankle. I catered his entire recovery diet for free. When he came back faster and leaner than before, he asked to see my books. Within 18 months, Caden and his teammate Jasper invested heavily. We scaled rapidly. We didn't just open in Seattle. We expanded to Portland, then San Francisco, then Denver. 20 major cities. I wasn't a struggling line cook in a stained apron anymore. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar wellness and logistics brand. And then there was Serena. Serena was the logistics director Caden brought in to help me manage the chaotic expansion. She was sharp, unsentimental, and brilliant. We spent nights tracing supply chain routes on whiteboards whiteboard, drinking black coffee, dismantling problems until the sun came up. We fell in love in the trenches of building a business. She didn't want a ring made of wire. She wanted a partner who could match her pace. When I finally proposed, I put a flawless 3-carat diamond on her finger. Meanwhile, Dominic's empire was a mirage. He wasn't a Wall Street genius. He was running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme masking as a decentralized crypto fund. I found out the same way everyone else did, on the morning news. The FBI and SEC raided his downtown firm on a Tuesday. The footage showed Dominic being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, looking pale and terrified. It came out in the following weeks that Natalie's parents, Stellan and Blythe, had been dazzled by him. They had eagerly invested their entire retirement fund into his fake portfolio. Stellan had even taken out a second mortgage on the house to give Dominic more capital. They lost everything overnight. Dominic was facing 20 years in federal prison. Natalie was suddenly penniless, legally entangled in the fallout, and entirely radioactive in her former social circle. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman who was engaged to the city's biggest fraud. I hadn't thought about Natalie in over a year. I was busy. I was hosting a massive charity gala at my flagship Chicago restaurant, a sprawling modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed steel beams. The room was packed with athletes, investors, and local politicians. I was standing near the coat check when the front doors opened. Natalie bypassed the security ropes. She looked haggard. The glossy finish was gone. Her hair was messy, and she was clutching a worn-out leather purse like a shield. She spotted me and marched straight past the hostess, invading my personal space in the lobby. I was manipulated, she sobbed, the tears coming instantly. She reached out to grab my suit jacket. Dominic lied to me. He ruined my family's life. We're losing the house. But you, I saw what you built. You always had a good heart. You're the only one who really understood me. We can fix this. I didn't step back. I just looked at her. I felt absolutely nothing. You didn't want me when I smelled like onions, I said, my voice low and completely flat. You called my dream a joke. You threw my ring in the garbage. Now that the federal government took your meal ticket, you want a free bailout? Before she could speak, the velvet curtain separating the VIP lounge parted. Serena stepped out. She was wearing a midnight blue evening gown, holding a glass of sparkling water. She looked at Natalie, taking in the frantic energy, the tears, the desperation. Serena didn't look angry. She looked at Natalie with disgusted pity. Is there a problem out here? Serena asked, walking over and confidently taking my hand. Natalie's bloodshot eyes darted down to Serena's hand. She saw the diamond. It caught the light from the chandeliers. Natalie's face contorted into something ugly and broken. I believed in you first, Natalie shrieked. Her voice cracked, echoing off the marble floors. Conversations in the lobby stopped. Wealthy patrons turned to stare. I lived in that freezing apartment. I gave you my best years. You owe me. I looked at the bouncers by the door and gave a sharp nod. Two men in black suits stepped forward, flanking Natalie. I don't owe you a single dime, I said. As security dragged her backward toward the glass doors, she kicked and screamed, her voice shrill against the cold night air. She was weeping about her parents, about the mortgage, about how unfair it all was. I didn't watch her get thrown out onto the sidewalk. I turned back to my soulmate, kissed the side of her head, and we walked back into the beautiful, secure empire we had built together. 3 days later, the envelope arrived. I was sitting in my glass-walled office above the Chicago restaurant. It was a Tuesday morning. The mail had been sorted by my assistant. Most of it was vendor contracts and lease agreements, but sitting in the middle of the stack was a standard manila envelope with no return address. I opened it with a letter opener. Inside was a single photograph. It was slightly grainy, printed on heavy photo paper. It looked like it had been taken from across a restaurant a few years ago. I stared at it. It was Dominic. He was sitting at a high-end steakhouse, shaking hands across a table with a man I hadn't thought about in years. It was Arlo Trask, the loan officer from the regional bank in Portland, the man who had denied the loan for my food truck the day after Natalie left me. My chest tightened. I flipped the photograph over. Stapled to the back was a small piece of heavy cardstock. Written in blue ink, in unfamiliar handwriting, were 2 sentences. He didn't deny you by accident. Ask Serena what she knew. The sounds of the busy office outside my door seemed to drop away. The hum of the espresso machine, the chatter of the marketing team, the ringing phones, it all faded into a dull, distant rush of static. I read the words again. Ask Serena what she knew. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Serena, texting me from her office 2 floors down. Lunch at 1? I found a great spot for the new distribution hub. I looked at her name on the screen. Then I looked at the photograph of Dominic and Arlo Trask. I felt a cold, metallic taste in the back of my mouth. I didn't reply to Serena. I put the photograph in my breast pocket, walked out of my office, and told my assistant I was taking the rest of the day off. I flew to Portland that afternoon. I didn't tell Serena where I was going. I just texted her that an urgent supply chain issue had come up with one of our West Coast vendors, and I had to handle it in person. It was the first time I had ever lied to her. The lie tasted like ass. I landed in Portland as the sun was setting, casting a gray, bruised light over the city. I rented a car and drove straight to the regional bank where Arlo Trask used to work. I already knew he wasn't there. I had spent the 4-hour flight doing some quiet digging on my laptop. Trask had been fired from the bank 2 years ago, right around the time Dominic's fund started showing cracks. Now, according to a few bleak public records, Trask was working as a finance manager at a used car lot on the outskirts of the city. I pulled into the lot at 7 p.m. It was raining, that same misting, relentless Portland rain I used to walk home in. The lot was bathed in the harsh, buzzing glow of fluorescent lights, strung over rows of wet sedans. Trask was sitting in a small, glass-walled office at the back of the lot. He looked older, his hair was thinning, and he was wearing a cheap tie that hung loosely around his neck. I opened the door to his office. The bell above it chimed aggressively. Trask looked up from his computer. He squinted at me for a second. Then his face dropped. He recognized me. Of course he did. My face was in half the business magazines he probably passed in the grocery store checkout aisle. I'm not looking to buy a car, Arlo, I said, closing the door behind me and locking it. Trask swallowed hard. He leaned back in his squeaky desk chair. I didn't think so. You're doing well for yourself these days. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the photograph, and dropped it face up on his messy desk. It landed on top of a stack of financing applications. Trask looked at the picture of himself shaking hands with Dominic. He didn't look surprised. He just looked exhausted. He rubbed a hand over his face and let out a long, ragged sigh. Who sent it to you? Trask asked quietly. I don't know, I said. And I don't care. I care about what it means. You denied my loan. Your credit wasn't great. Trask deflected weakly, not making eye contact. My credit was fine, I snapped, stepping closer to the desk. My business plan was bulletproof. I had the collateral. You denied it the day after Natalie broke off the engagement. Tell me why Dominic was shaking your hand. Trask looked out the window at the rain hitting the windshields of the used cars. It wasn't just Dominic. It was Stellan, her father. Stellan did a lot of commercial real estate business with our branch. He brought millions through our doors. Dominic was his new golden boy. Trask finally looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and pathetic. Stellan called me the week before you applied. He said his daughter was slumming it with a line cook. He said he needed you to hit rock bottom so she would finally cut the cord and go with Dominic. He told me that if I approved your loan, he would pull every commercial account he had with the bank. Dominic offered me a $10,000 cash consulting fee under the table to make sure your paperwork got buried. I stood there in the fluorescent light, the reality of it washing over me. They hadn't just laughed at me. They had actively, maliciously rigged the game to keep me poor. They had bought my failure. I took the money, Trask said, his voice barely a whisper. I had alimony payments. I'm sorry. When Dominic went down, the feds started looking at everyone connected to him. The bank quietly let me go before I could become a liability. Now I'm financing used Hondas at 18% APR. I stared at him. The anger was there, but it was overshadowed by the second sentence on the back of the photograph. What does my fiancée have to do with this? I asked. Trask frowned. The blonde? The one from the gala? Serena. What does she know? Trask shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Before she was your logistics director, do you know where she worked? She was a senior auditor at a logistics firm in Seattle. Before that, Trask said, 3 years ago, she was an internal compliance auditor for this bank. My bank. The floor felt like it was tilting. When Dominic's account first started throwing red flags internally, Trask continued. Before the feds ever got involved, the bank put an auditor on it to quietly check the exposure. It was Serena. She tracked the wire transfers. She found the 10 grand consulting fee Dominic paid me. She found the emails between Stellan and the branch manager about your loan. She didn't know me then, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the small office. No, she did, Trask agreed. But she audited the files. She knew exactly what Stellan and Dominic did to you. She had all the documentation. And then, a year later, she leaves the bank, moves to Seattle, and suddenly she's the right hand to the guy whose file she investigated. Trask leaned forward, tapping a finger on the desk. She knew they ruined you. She had the proof. When you two started dating, when you were building your company, she never told you? She never mentioned she held the smoking gun that could have sent Stellan and Dominic to jail a year earlier? I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I picked the photograph up off the desk, put it back in my pocket, and walked out into the rain. I flew back to Chicago that night. I didn't sleep on the plane. I just stared out the small oval window into the pitch black of the sky, my mind playing back every conversation, every late night Serena and I had spent together. She was the one who had streamlined the business. She was the one who told me to expand into Denver when I hesitated. She had been my compass, but she had known. When I unlocked the door to our penthouse in downtown Chicago, it was 2:00 a.m. The apartment was dark, except for the soft glow of the city lights bleeding through the floor to ceiling windows. Serena was sitting at the massive marble kitchen island. She was wearing a silk robe, holding a mug of tea. Her laptop was open in front of her. She looked up when I walked in. She didn't look surprised. The West Coast vendor? She asked quietly. I walked into the kitchen. I didn't take off my coat. I pulled the photograph out of my pocket and set it down on the marble island, right next to her laptop. I turned it over so she could read the blue ink on the back. Ask Serena what she knew. Serena looked down at it. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She just slowly closed her laptop. She picked up her tea, took a sip, and looked at me. Her eyes were perfectly calm. That was the most terrifying part. She wasn't caught off guard. Who sent this to you? She asked. Her voice was steady, analytical, exactly the way she sounded in board meeting. Arlo Trask. I lied. I wanted to see her reaction. She shook her head slightly. Trask doesn't have the spine to start trouble. It was probably Natalie. She's desperate, and desperate people dig through the trash to find leverage. Someone from her father's old circles probably tipped her off about my old job. So it's true, I said. My voice was shaking, just a little. I hated that it was shaking. You were the auditor. I was, Serena said. She set the mug down. You knew what Stellan and Dominic did to me. You knew they bribed Trask to deny my loan. You had the paper trail. I did. We've been together for 2 years, I said, my voice rising, bouncing off the high ceilings of the penthouse. We built a life together. You wore my ring, and you sat across from me every single night, knowing exactly who destroyed my first business, and you said nothing. Serena stood up. She walked around the island and stood in front of me. She didn't look guilty. She looked completely resolute. When I audited that file, Serena said, her tone infuriatingly level, I saw a guy who got completely screwed over by the people who were supposed to be his family. I flagged it to the bank. The bank buried it to protect Stellan's account. I quit 2 months later because I refused to work for cowards. But when you met me, I pushed, stepping closer to her. When I hired you, why didn't you hand me the files then? Why didn't you tell me you knew? Serena looked up at me, her eyes locked onto mine. Because I saw what you were doing. I saw the fire in you. You were working 20 hours a day. You were building something incredible because you were angry. You had a chip on your shoulder that was going to make you a billionaire. She reached out and placed a hand on my chest. I didn't move away, but my skin crawled. If I had given you those files, she continued softly, you would have stopped building. You would have taken those files to a lawyer. You would have spent the next 3 years tied up in civil litigation, fighting Stellan and Dominic in court for a few $100,000 in damages. You would have wanted justice. I deserve justice. I shouted. Justice doesn't build empires. Serena snapped back, her voice finally cracking like a whip. Hunger builds empires. You didn't need a lawsuit. You needed to prove them wrong. If I had given you closure, you would have settled for a successful food truck in Portland. I didn't want a guy with a food truck. I wanted the man standing in front of me right now. I stared at her. The woman I loved. The woman I had built my life with. You engineered me, I whispered. I protected your momentum, she corrected, her voice smoothing out again. I let you use the pain to build the foundation. And once you had the power, Dominic and Stellan destroyed themselves anyway. The universe took care of them, and we got everything. She looked around the penthouse, at the skyline outside the windows, at the life we had bought. We won, she said softly. I looked at her hand, at the 3-carat diamond I had bought her. It looked cold. It looked heavy. I realized, standing there in the dark, that I had traded one cage for another. Natalie had wanted me to be someone else, someone wealthier, someone she could show off. Serena didn't want me to be someone else. She just wanted me to be a weapon, and she had kept the safety off on purpose. I backed away from her. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I looked at the photograph on the marble counter. I need to leave, I said. Don't be dramatic, Serena said, her tone suddenly shifting to annoyance, the way it did when a vendor missed a a delivery window. You're shocked. I get it, but nothing has changed. We have a board meeting at 9 tomorrow. We're closing the Denver acquisition. I said I'm leaving, Serena. I turned and walked toward the door. As my hand hit the brass handle, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from an unknown number. I know you went to Portland today. I know you talked to Trask. Serena isn't the only one who kept copies of the audit files. Let's talk about my parents' mortgage. I stood in the doorway. Serena was watching me from the kitchen, her arms crossed, waiting for me to be rational. I looked down at the text from Natalie. The past I thought I had buried was suddenly crawling out of the dirt, holding the very files my fiancé had hidden from me. I didn't open the door. I didn't step back into the apartment. I just stood on the threshold, caught between the woman who ruined my past and the woman who manipulated my future. I let the brass handle slip from my grip and pulled the door shut until it clicked. The heavy thud of the solid oak sealed off the penthouse, and with it, the life I thought I was living. I didn't wait for the elevator. I pushed through the fire doors and started walking down the concrete stairwell. My footsteps echoed, sharp and rapid, bouncing off the cinderblock walls. I stared at the screen of my phone. Natalie's message glared back at me in the dim light. Let's talk about my parents' mortgage. I typed one word, where. 3 floors down, my phone buzzed. The diner on Wabash. 10 minutes. I pushed out into the freezing Chicago night. The wind off the lake cut right through my coat, but I barely felt it. I walked the 4 blocks to the diner. It was one of the few places open at this hour. A greasy spoon with flickering neon in the window. The smell of stale coffee and fryer oil hit me the second I walked in. It smelled exactly like my old life. Natalie was sitting in a booth all the way in the back. She didn't look like the woman who had crashed my gala a few nights ago. The frantic, sobbing mess was gone. She looked sharp, focused, and completely exhausted. She had a thick manila folder resting on the cracked Formica table in front of her. I slid into the booth across from her. I didn't take my coat off. I didn't order anything. Trask called you, I said. Natalie took a sip of her coffee. Trask called my dad. My dad called me. They're both terrified, but I'm not. What do you want, Natalie? She patted the manila folder. This is everything. The emails between my father and the bank manager. The wire transfer receipts for Dominic's 10 grand bribe. The internal audit notes Serena signed off on 3 years ago. Serena didn't just find the fraud and quit. She used it. I went perfectly still. Used it how? She didn't tell you? Natalie smiled, a thin, bitter line. Serena didn't just walk away from that bank on moral grounds. When she found out Dominic was running a Ponzi scheme, she didn't report it to the SEC. She waited. She tracked the money. Found out he was funneling capital through a shell company in Delaware, and she shorted the very crypto assets Dominic was falsely inflating. She made a fortune off his collapse. That's how she had the capital to fund your first massive distribution hub in Denver. She didn't secure an outside loan. She used Dominic's blood money. My stomach dropped. I remembered the Denver expansion. Serena had brought in an anonymous angel investor through a holding company to finance the lease on the massive warehouse. I had been so desperate to grow, so blinded by the momentum, I just signed the paperwork. You're lying, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Natalie slid the folder across the table. Open it. Look at the routing numbers. The holding company belongs to Serena. She leveraged my family's ruin. She leveraged your stolen food truck, and she used it to build her own safety net inside your company. I opened the folder. The top page was a corporate registry printout. The holding company, Apex Logistics, LLC, was registered in Delaware. The sole managing member was Serena. I flipped to the next page. A wire transfer for $2.5 million, timed exactly 3 weeks after Dominic was raided by the FBI. If I take this to the Fed, Natalie said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, Serena goes to prison for insider trading and failing to report a federal crime as a compliance officer. And your company, your pristine, hyper-niche athletic brand, it gets dragged right into the mud as the beneficiary of illicit funds. Your NFL investors will pull out before breakfast. I looked up at her. The neon sign buzzed against the window. You don't care about the Fed. You care about the house. My parents are 2 weeks away from foreclosure, Natalie said, leaning forward. Stellan is working the hardware aisle at Home Depot. My mother won't even leave her bedroom. Dominic took $2.2 million from them. That's what I want. You want me to pay you $2.2 million. I want you to buy my silence, she corrected. Pay off the mortgage. Restore their retirement. You do that, and I hand over the only hard copies of these files. You can take them back to your penthouse and burn them in front of your sociopath fiancé. I'll disappear. You keep your empire. Everyone wins. I stared at the woman I used to love. I remembered forging that copper wire ring, sitting on the floor of our drafty apart, thinking she was the best thing that ever happened to me. Now, she was extorting me for the exact amount her father had lost trying to ruin me. You realize what you're asking, I said. You want me to bail out the man who paid to destroy my life. He's an old, broken man, Natalie said, her voice cracking slightly, a flash of genuine desperation breaking through the cold facade. He lost. You won. You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Just cut the check. And if I don't, then tomorrow morning, I walk into the SEC field office here in Chicago, and I burn Serena to the ground, and she'll take you down with her. I closed the folder. I kept my hand resting on top of it. I need 48 hours to liquidate that kind of cash quietly. I can't just write a personal check for $2 million without my CFO flagging. Natalie watched me, her eyes narrowing. 48 hours. Not a minute more. Don't try to play me. You know I have nothing left to lose. She slid out of the booth, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the diner without looking back. I sat there alone for a long time. The waitress came by and poured me a cup of black coffee. I didn't touch it. I had thought I was the one building the empire. I thought I was the architect, but I was just the engine. Serena was the driver, and she had driven us right into a minefield. If I paid Natalie, I was letting Stellan win. I was bailing out the very arrogance that had mocked me on that deck in Lake Tahoe. But if I didn't pay her, Serena would be investigated. The company would be audited. My life's work would be seized, frozen, or dismantled by federal regulators. I picked up my phone. It was 4:15 a.m. I pulled up the contact for Jasper, the linebacker who had co-invested in the company with Caden early on. Jasper wasn't just a silent partner anymore. He sat on our executive board. He was the only person involved in the company whose loyalty was to me, not Serena. I sent a text. Are you awake? The reply came seconds later. Always. What's up? I need you to pull the incorporation docs for the Denver hub. Don't go through legal. Don't let Serena see the system ping. Just get them and meet me at the flagship in an hour. I left a 20 on the table and walked out into the cold. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went before I made a move. When I got to the restaurant, the dining room was pitch black. The chairs were stacked on the tables. The only light came from the small office in the back. Jasper was already there, sitting at my desk, the glow of his tablet illuminating his face. He was a massive guy, a mountain of muscle squeezed into a tailored tracksuit, but he had a mind like a steel trap when it came to contracts. I closed the office door and locked it. Jasper looked up, his expression grim. He turned the tablet around and slid it across the desk toward me. "You look like hell," Jasper said quietly, "and you're about to feel worse." I looked down at the screen. It was a digital scan of the original lease and capitalization agreement for the Denver facility. "Apex Logistics," I said, reading the name of the holding company Natalie had shown me. "Yeah," Jasper said, leaning back and crossing his massive arms. I dug into the corporate structure. Apex didn't just fund the Denver hub. They funded the initial logistics software we use nationwide. They own the proprietary routing algorithm Serena brought to the table, so she owns a piece of our tech. "No, man," Jasper said heavily. "She owns the tech. The parent company, our company, leases it from Apex. But that's not the worst part. I pulled the master operating agreement we all signed during the Series B funding round." Serena buried a clause in the intellectual property section. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck. "What clause?" "A trigger clause. If Serena is ever terminated, investigated by a federal authority, or removed from her position as logistics director, Apex immediately revokes the software license. It's an automatic kill switch." Jasper leaned forward, his voice low and tight. "If anyone goes after Serena, she pulls the plug on the software that runs our entire supply chain. The ghost kitchens, the delivery routes, the athlete dietary tracking, everything goes dark in seconds. We'd be paralyzed. We'd bleed out in less than a week." She hadn't just used Dominic's money. She had built a hostage situation into the foundation of my company. "She weaponized the infrastructure," I muttered, staring at the screen. "She didn't just build you an empire," Jasper said, his eyes locking onto mine. "She built herself a throne, and she wired the whole place to blow. If she goes down, we all go down." I sat heavily in the chair opposite him. Natalie's threat echoed in my head. "Tomorrow morning, I walk into the SEC field office. If Natalie went to the SEC, the investigation would trigger the clause. Serena's kill switch would activate. The company would die." "Jasper," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the freefall in my chest, "how much liquid cash do I have access to without Serena or the CFO approving the transfer?" Jasper frowned, tapping a few keys on his tablet. "Personal accounts? After the recent real estate acquisitions, maybe 800,000. The rest is tied up in equity or requires dual authorization." "Why? What kind of fire are you trying to put out?" "A $2.2 million one," I said. Jasper stared at me. "I can float you $1 million from my trust, but I need to know what I'm buying." "You're buying 48 hours of silence from a ghost," I said. Jasper stared at me, the blue light from his tablet casting long shadows across his face. The hum of the restaurant's commercial refrigerators clicked on in the kitchen, a low, vibrating drone that rattled the silence in the office. $2.2 million, Jasper repeated slowly, his voice dropping an octave. "You don't ask for that kind of money to make a small problem go away. Who is the ghost?" I rubbed my eyes. The exhaustion was a physical weight on my shoulders, but my mind was racing too fast to feel it. "My ex-fiancée, Natalie. She has the internal audit files from the bank Serena used to work at. The ones proving Serena knew my first business was intentionally sabotaged by Natalie's father and a corrupt loan officer." Jasper frowned, leaning forward. "Okay, that's a massive breach of trust, and it makes Serena a manipulative nightmare. But it's not illegal for your fiancé to keep a secret. Why the hell is Natalie asking for $2 million? "Because that's not all Serena did," I said, leaning over the desk. I laid it out for him, exactly how Natalie had explained it in the diner. How Serena had tracked Dominic's illicit funds, shorted the crypto assets, and used the profits from the collapse of a federal Ponzi scheme to fund Apex Logistics. How she had used that dirty money to lease our first distribution hub and build the proprietary software that ran our entire company. Jasper didn't interrupt. He just sat there, perfectly still, absorbing the information. He had spent 10 years in professional football reading defensive lines before the snap. He knew how to process a threat without panicking. When I finished, he looked back down at his tablet, staring at the master operating agreement he had pulled. "If Natalie takes those files to the SEC," Jasper said, his voice flat and analytical, "Serena gets investigated for insider trading and compliance failure. That triggers the kill switch in our contract. Apex revokes the software license. We lose the distribution hubs, the routing algorithms, the client database. The company flatlines in 48 hours. "Exactly," I said. "And the NFL investors you brought in? They find out their money is tied up in a company built on the ashes of a Ponzi scheme. They pull their backing. We're dead in the water. So I need to pay Natalie the $2.2 million to pay off her parents' mortgage and buy the only hard copies of those files." Jasper shook his head. He locked the tablet screen and tossed it onto the desk. "No, Jasper, we don't have a choice. You never pay the blackmailer, man," Jasper said, looking me dead in the eye. "I learned that my rookie year in the league. You pay them once, they own you forever. Natalie might give you those files tomorrow, but what happens in 6 months when her dad needs a new car? What happens in a year when she decides she wants a vacation home? She knows she has the button that destroys your life. She will press it whenever she needs cash. Then what's the play? Because the clock is ticking. 48 hours. The play isn't dealing with Natalie," Jasper said. "Natalie is just a symptom. The disease is Serena. She built a backdoor into our house, and she's holding the only key. We have to neutralize the kill switch before the SEC ever gets involved." "How?" "You just read the clause. If we try to fire her, it triggers. If we try to remove her from the board, it triggers." Jasper picked up the tablet again and unlocked it. I said, "If we remove her. The clause says the license is revoked if Serena is terminated, investigated, or removed from her position. It doesn't say anything about what happens if she voluntarily relinquishes her shares in Apex Logistics, or if she dilutes her own voting power to a minority stake. She would never do that," I said. "She's a control freak. She orchestrated my entire career just to make sure she was the one holding the reins. She's not going to just hand over the keys, not willingly," Jasper agreed. "But she doesn't know we know about Apex. She doesn't know Natalie approached you tonight. Right now, as far as Serena is concerned, you're just mad about the old bank files. You're emotional. You're reeling from a betrayal of trust. You need to play into that." I looked at the digital clock on the desk. It was 5:30 am. The sun would be coming up over Lake Michigan soon. "We have the board meeting at 9, I said. "We're supposed to be finalizing the Denver acquisition." "Right," Jasper said, his eyes narrowing as he started scrolling through the meeting agenda on his tablet. "And look at item 4. Serena is pushing for a structural integration of the new Denver facilities into the central Apex routing network. She wants to expand the software's reach into the new warehouse warehouses. Why does she care about that? Because the more of our physical assets that rely on her software, the tighter the noose gets, Jasper said grimly. She's trying to deepen the dependency. But to do that, she needs the board to authorize a new licensing addendum with Apex Logistics. Jasper looked up at me, a cold, calculated expression on his face. If she introduces a new addendum today, that opens up the Apex operating agreement for a vote. We can't fire her, but we can amend the corporate structure of the holding company if we have a unanimous board vote. And right now, the board is you, me, and her. She's not going to vote against her own interests, I said. She will, if you back her into a corner she can't see her way out of, Jasper said. You have to go back to that penthouse. You have to put on a suit, walk into that boardroom at 9 o'clock, and look at the woman who engineered your life like you're still in love with her. Can you do that? I thought about the cold, metallic look in Serena's eyes when she told me she kept the files to protect my momentum. I thought about the 3-carat diamond on her finger, paid for by the sweat off my back, and the dirty money she had hidden in the walls of our company. Yeah, I said, my voice hardening. I can do that. I left the restaurant at 6:15 am. I didn't go back to the penthouse immediately. I went to a high-end gym a few blocks away where I had a membership, took a freezing cold shower in the locker room, and changed into a spare suit I kept in my locker. I drank 2 cups of black coffee, staring at the tile wall, compartmentalizing the rage that was threatening to boil over. When I finally swiped my keycard and walked into the corporate office suite at 8:15 am, the floor was already buzzing. Assistants were printing quarterly reports. The smell of fresh espresso wafted from the break room. It looked like a machine running perfectly. Serena was standing by the glass walls of the main conference room, reviewing a slide deck with Hayden, who had flown in for the meeting. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. She looked sharp, untouchable. She saw me walk in. She didn't flinch. She just tapped the screen, said something to Hayden, and walked over to me. You didn't come home last night, she said quietly, her voice perfectly modulated so the passing staff wouldn't hear. I slept at the flagship. I lied, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I needed to clear my head. She studied my face, looking for cracks. And, is it clear? You were right, I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I was emotional. I was looking backward. If you had given me those files 3 years ago, I would have wasted years fighting Stellan in court. We wouldn't have this. I gestured to the sprawling office. Serena's posture relaxed, just a fraction of an inch. A small, victorious smile touched the corner of her mouth. She reached out and adjusted the lapel of my suit jacket. I told you, she murmured. I only ever wanted to build the best version of you. We're a team. We're a team, I echoed. Good, she said, tapping her tablet. Because the Denver acquisition is critical. I need you completely focused in there. Jasper has been pushing back on the software integration costs all week. I need you to overrule him. I'll handle Jasper, I said. At exactly 9 am, we took our seats at the massive oak table in the conference room. Jasper sat across from me, his massive frame dwarfing the ergonomic chair. Hayden was dialing in from the screen on the wall, having stepped out to take a call. 2 lawyers from our external firm were sitting at the far end, shuffling through stacks of paper. Serena stood at the head of the table. She fired up the presentation. She was brilliant. There was no denying that. She broke down the logistics, the supply chain efficiencies, the projected revenue increases for the Denver market. It was a flawless pitch. To maximize the efficiency of the new hubs, Serena said, clicking to the final slide, we need to fully integrate them into our central routing matrix. I've prepared a licensing addendum to extend the Apex Logistics software to the new facility. It requires a slight increase in the licensing fee, but the ROI covers it in 6 weeks. She slid a thick stack of stapled documents down the table. Jasper picked his up. I picked mine up. I've read through the addendum, Jasper said, his voice entirely casual. He leaned back in his chair. The numbers make sense, but I have a concern about the liability structure of Apex. Serena stopped clicking her pen. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of concern, Jasper? Apex is an LLC registered in Delaware, Jasper said, flipping to the second page of the document. But it operates entirely as a pass-through entity for our proprietary tech. Right now, Serena, you're listed as the sole managing member. If we're going to push 30% of our new national infrastructure through this software, we need redundancy. We can't have a single point of failure at the top of the holding company. Serena looked at me. It was a sharp, demanding look. It was the look she gave me when she expected me to fall in line and crush whoever was questioning her authority. I didn't look at her. I looked at the document. He has a point, I said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Serena stared at me, the facade of the perfect corporate partner slipping for a microsecond. The structure of Apex is non-negotiable, Serena said, her voice tight. It was established during the Series B funding. Sure, Jasper said reasonably. But this addendum opens the door for restructuring. If we're going to approve the Denver integration today, we need to amend the operating agreement of Apex. We need to add myself and the CEO as equal managing members of the LLC. We dilute the equity, spread the liability, standard corporate governance. Serena's hands were flat on the table. She was doing the math in her head. If she made us equal members of Apex, she lost her unilateral control. She lost the ability to trigger the kill switch without our consent. We were trying to disarm the bomb while she was standing right next to it. I'm not diluting my equity in the holding company, Serena said, her voice cold and absolute. The software was my capital contribution. Then we don't approve the addendum, I said, finally looking up and meeting her eyes. And we don't integrate the Denver facilities into the central routing network. We'll run them on a third-party, off-the-shelf logistics program. That will tank our efficiency ratings, Serena snapped, her composure cracking. It's a massive step backward. You're talking about crippling the expansion over a bureaucratic technicality. I'm talking about protecting the company, I said. Before Serena could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up. It was a text from Natalie. 36 hours. My dad just got the final notice from the bank. Do you have the money or do I go to the SEC? I kept my face completely blank. I flipped the phone face down on the table. Serena saw the movement. She didn't see the text, but she saw the tension in my jaw. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know the walls were closing in on her from the outside too. We are not amending the Apex structure, Serena said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She leaned over the table, looking directly at me. I built this infrastructure. I own it. And if you try to force my hand, I will pull the licensing entirely. We can see how well your empire runs on paper and pencils. She had just threatened the kill switch in front of the board. Jasper and I exchanged a brief, hard look. She was doubling down. Let's take a 10-minute reset, Jasper said, standing up. Clear our head. We can vote when we get back. The lawyers scurried out of the room. Hayden muted his screen. Serena grabbed her tablet and walked out without a word, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind her. I sat alone at the table with Jasper. She's not going to budge, Jasper said quietly. She'd rather blow the whole thing up than give up control. Then we don't have a choice, I said, picking up my phone and staring at the blank back of the case. We have to figure out a way to break Apex Logistics from the outside before Natalie makes good on her threat. You have an idea? Trask, I said. Jasper frowned. The used car salesman? The bank manager? Trask processed Dominic's bribe. Trask approved the internal audits that Serena signed off on, I said, standing up and grabbing my suit jacket. Serena thinks she's untouchable because she buried the paper trail, but Trask was there. If Natalie has the documents, Trask has the contact. I need to know exactly how Serena moved that money from Dominic's shell company into Apex without tripping federal alarm. There has to be a flaw in the transfer. If we can prove Apex was funded illegally before the SEC investigates, we can petition a judge to void the master operating agreement based on fraudulent inducement. The kill switch becomes legally unenforceable. Jasper nodded slowly. That's a massive legal gamble. If the judge doesn't grant the injunction immediately, the SEC seizes everything. It's the only play we have, I said. I'm going back to Portland. My flight left O'Hare at noon. I spent the entire 4 hours in the air staring at the back of the seat in front of me, running the legal permutations of what Jasper and I had discussed. If I could prove Serena's holding company was capitalized with the proceeds of a federal crime, the operating agreement that gave her unilateral control over my company would be rendered null and void. The kill switch would vanish. I landed in Portland just as the gray afternoon was bruising into a dark, wet evening. I didn't bother renting a car this time. I grabbed a cab from the taxi rank and gave the driver the address of the used car lot on the outskirts of the city. When we pulled in, the neon signs were buzzing, but the small glass office at the back of the lot was dark. A kid in a cheap windbreaker was locking up a row of sedans. I rolled down the window. Where's Arlo? I shouted over the rain. The kid looked at me, shivering. Trask? He called out today. Said he had a stomach bug. I handed the cab driver a $100 bill. Keep the meter running. We're going to a residential address. It took me 20 minutes on my phone to pull Arlo Trask's home address from public property tax record. He lived in a brutalist concrete apartment complex out in Beaverton, the kind of place with exposed outdoor walkways and rust stains trailing down from the gutters. I told the cab driver to wait at the curb and walked up the metal stairs to the 3rd floor. I banged on apartment 314. I didn't wait. I banged again, harder. The door opened a crack, secured by a tarnished brass chain. Trask looked out. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt, his eyes bloodshot, a heavy stubble covering his jaw. He smelled like cheap bourbon and stale sweat. When he saw me, he tried to slam the door, but I wedged my heavy leather boot into the gap. We're not done talking, Arlo, I said, my voice low. I told you everything yesterday, he hissed, his voice muffled by the wood. I don't have anything else to say. Go away before I call the cops. Call them, I challenged, leaning my weight against the door. Let's have a chat with them about the 10 grand Dominic handed you in a parking garage 3 years ago. I'm sure the statute of limitations on federal bank fraud hasn't expired yet. Trask stopped pushing against the door. He unlatched the chain and stepped back, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I walked into the apartment. It was depressing. Cardboard boxes were stacked in the corner, acting as an end table. A small television was playing a muted infomercial in the background. The kitchen sink was piled high with dirty dishes. What do you want? Trask asked, rubbing his face with shaking hands. You already know they rigged the game. You already know Serena audited the files. I have nothing left to give you. I need the proof, I said, standing in the middle of his cramped living room. I need the actual audit files Serena signed off on. Trask let out a dry, hacking laugh. Are you out of your mind? The bank destroyed those files the day the FBI raided Dominic. They scrubbed the internal servers to make sure they couldn't be implicated in his Ponzi scheme. Stellan pulled his commercial accounts 2 days later, and they fired me to tie up the loose end. There is no proof. Natalie has a hard copy, I said. Trask stopped laughing. He stared at me, his brow furrowing. Natalie? Stellan's kid? Yeah, she ambushed me with a manila folder last night. She's extorting me for $2 million to pay off her parents' mortgage. If I don't pay her, she takes the files to the SEC. Trask walked over to a cheap veneer dining table and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon into a dirty glass. He threw it back in one swallow. She's bluffing, he said quietly. I saw the files, Arlo. I saw your signature. I saw Serena's. No, Trask said, turning to face me. You saw copies. Stellan had copies because he was CC'd on the original email threads with the branch manager. When Stellan went bankrupt, Natalie must have gone digging through his home office. But copies of emails don't prove the bank knew the funds were illicit. They just prove we knew about the bribe to deny your loan. Natalie said the audit files prove Serena tracked the money into a shell company. I pushed. That she knew it was a Ponzi scheme. Trask shook his head slowly. Serena didn't just track the money. Kid, you still don't get it. He walked over to a battered filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the bottom drawer. It shrieked in protest on its metal track. When Serena did the internal audit, Trask said, pulling out a thick plastic wrap binder, she pulled me into a conference room. It was just the two of us. She showed me the paper trail on Dominic's bribe. She told me I was going to prison. I begged her not to report it. I told her I was drowning in alimony, that Stellan had threatened my job. Trask tossed the binder onto the dining table. It landed with a heavy thud. She told me she wouldn't report it, Trask continued, his voice hollow. On one condition. She told me she needed a 48-hour head start before she submitted her final audit report to the bank's compliance board. She said Dominic's crypto fund was entirely hollow, and when the audit hit the executives' desks, the bank was going to freeze his accounts. The collapse would be instantaneous. I stared at the binder. She needed a head start to short his asset. Exactly, Trask said. She used me to delay the internal freeze. She gave herself exactly 2 days to leverage her own capital against Dominic's fund. She knew exactly when the floor was going to drop out because she was the one holding the lever. When she finally submitted the report, the bank panicked, froze the accounts, and the SEC moved in 3 days later. Dominic went down, Stellan lost everything, and Serena walked away with millions in untraceable short sale profits. The sheer scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. Serena hadn't just capitalized on a tragedy. She had orchestrated the timing of the execution to maximize her own payout. And that binder? I asked, pointing to the table. When they fired me, I knew they were going to make me the scapegoat if the feds ever looked too close, Trask said. So the night before I was escorted out, I downloaded the server access log. This binder contains the digital footprint of every file Serena accessed, every internal memo she delayed, and the exact timestamps of when she finally submitted the audit. It proves she sat on a federal crime for 48 hours. He rested his hand on the plastic cover. With this, you can prove she violated her fiduciary duty to the bank and the SEC. It proves her holding company was funded by insider trading. I stepped toward the table. I need it. Trask pulled his hand back, keeping the binder close to him. You're a multi-millionaire. I'm selling used cars to people with sub-600 credit scores, and I'm 3 months behind on rent. This binder is the only life insurance policy I have left. How much? I asked. I didn't have time to negotiate. Natalie's clock was ticking down to under 30 hours. $50,000, Trask said, his voice trembling slightly. Cash or a direct wire transfer to an offshore account I have set up in the Cayman. I want it today. You get the money, you get the binder. It was a pathetic sum compared to what Natalie was asking for. Trask didn't want an empire. He just wanted to stop drowning. I'll have my CFO wire the funds as a consulting retainer, I said, pulling out my phone. It'll hit your account in 10 minutes. I stepped away, calling my head of finance. I authorized a $50,000 emergency disbursement for logistics consulting. I didn't care about the accounting headache it would cause later. 10 minutes later, Trask refreshed his laptop screen. His shoulders dropped in relief as the numbers populated in his account. He pushed the binder across the table. Take it, Trask said, sitting down heavily in his chair. And do me a favor. When you burn her to the ground, make sure my name stays out of the press. I put the binder in my leather briefcase. I'm not doing this for revenge, Arlo. I'm doing this to cut a cancer out of my company. I left his apartment and got back into the waiting cab. As we drove back toward the airport, I pulled out my phone and dialed Jasper. He picked up on the first ring. I have it, I said, staring out the window at the blurred, rain-slicked streets of Portland. I have the proof. Serena sat on the audit to time her short sale. The money she used to fund Apex Logistics is undeniably dirty. We can take this to a judge and void the operating agreement. That's good, Jasper said, but his voice was tight because the timeline just accelerated. What do you mean? Serena just sent out a company-wide memo, Jasper said, the sound of paper shuffling in the background. She called an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow. She's moving for an immediate vote on the Apex addendum while Caden is still in the building. She knows you left town. She knows you're stalling. She's going to force the integration of the Denver hubs tomorrow morning, and if we vote no, she's threatening to invoke the kill switch right there in the room. I tightened my grip on the phone. Serena was tired of playing the patient partner. She wanted the lock on the company finalized, and she was daring me to stop her. Call our outside counsel, I told Jasper. Tell them to draft an emergency injunction based on fraudulent inducement. Have them ready to file it the second the meeting starts. If she finds out we're filing an injunction, she'll sever the software license before the judge even reads the brief, Jasper warned. The company will go dark. She won't find out, I said, my voice hardening into something cold and absolute. Because I'm going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow and give her exactly what she wants. I walked into the glass-walled boardroom at 7:55 a.m. The sky over Chicago was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening snow. Serena was already at the head of the table. She looked immaculate, not a hair out of place, wearing a stark white blazer that made her look like clinical precision personified. Jasper was sitting to her left, his massive hands folded quietly on the oak surface. Caden was dialed in on the wall monitor, looking groggy but alert in his home office. Serena didn't waste time. Let's call the meeting to order, she said, her voice crisp and commanding. She slid the Apex licensing addendum down the center of the table. It stopped perfectly in front of my chair. We need to finalize the Denver integration. The vote is on the table. Do we have a motion to approve? I looked at the thick stack of paper. Then I looked at the woman I had almost married. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the plastic wrap binder I'd bought from Trask. I didn't slide it. I dropped it directly on top of her addendum. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. No motion, I said. We have a different item on the agenda. Serena stared at the binder. What is this? That is the server access log from your final week at the bank in Portland, I said. My voice was perfectly steady. The shaking from the night before was completely gone. It has the digital footprints and exact timestamps of every file you accessed, every internal memo you delayed, and the exact minute you finally submitted the audit on Dominic's fund. It proves you sat on a federal crime for 48 hours to short his assets. Serena's face didn't completely crumble, but the color drained from it instantly. Her eyes darted from the binder to me, her mind rapidly calculating the threat level. You're being ridiculous, she said, her voice tighter now, lacking its usual absolute authority. Those files were scrubbed. Trask is a liar. He's a liar who made a physical backup before they fired him, I corrected. And as of 7:50 a.m. this morning, our outside counsel filed an emergency injunction in federal court, petitioning a judge to void the master operating agreement of Apex Logistics on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. Jasper leaned forward, picking up the thread effortlessly. Because Apex was capitalized using the proceeds of an unreported federal crime, he added, his deep voice filling the room, the holding company's contracts are currently frozen under federal review, including the kill switch. You touch the software network now, it's obstruction of justice and destruction of corporate assets. Serena looked at Jasper, then back at me. Her jaw tightened. If you filed that injunction, the SEC will be looking at this company by noon. You just burned down your own house to get me out of it. I didn't burn it down, I said, leaning over the table. I installed a firewall. I'm turning the files over voluntarily as a whistleblower. The company will take a PR hit. Sure, the board will have to cooperate with a federal audit, but we survived. The NFL backers won't pull out when they see we proactively cut out the rot. But you, Serena, you don't survive this. She stared at me. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. For the first time since I met her, she had no leverage, no backdoor, no exit strategy. I had taken the bomb she built and disarmed it in her hand. What do you want? She asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the affectionate manipulation she had tried to use on me yesterday. I want you to sign a complete divestment of your shares in Apex and this company, I said. You resign as logistics director effective immediately. You sign over the proprietary rights to the software algorithm as restitution for defrauding this board. You walk out of this building with nothing but the clothes on your back. And if I don't, then I call the SEC field office right now, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and placing it on the table. And instead of just losing the company, you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for insider trading and compliance fraud. She looked at the phone. Then she looked at the 3-carat diamond on her left hand. Slowly, methodically, she slid the ring off her finger. She didn't throw it. She placed it carefully next to the binder. You think you can run this without me? She said quietly. I know I can, I replied. replied. You were just the architect of the prison. I'm the one who built the empire. She didn't say another word. She stood up, smoothed the front of her white blazer, and walked out of the boardroom. She didn't look back. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, sealing her out of my life for good. I sat down in my chair. Jasper let out a long, heavy breath, rubbing the back of his neck. On the screen, Caden let out a low whistle. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Natalie. You have 2 hours left. Are you wiring the money or not? I picked up the phone. I thought about the drafty apartment in Portland. I thought about the smell of stale grease, the cheap copper wire, the look on Stellan's face when he mocked my dreams on the deck in Lake Tahoe. I thought about Arlo Trask sitting in a depressing apartment, selling used Hondas to people who were just as trapped as he was. I typed my reply. I'm not wiring a dime. The SEC already has the files. Tell your father to start packing. I hit send. Then I blocked her number. I slid the phone back into my pocket. So, Jasper said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. We need a new logistics director, and we need to finalize the Denver acquisition before lunch. I looked out the floor to ceiling windows. The gray clouds over Lake Michigan were finally starting to break, a thin sliver of morning sunlight cutting through the gloom, hitting the steel and glass of the city I had conquered. Draft the job listing, I said, and tell Denver we're closing the deal today. I leaned back in my chair, the crushing weight of the last 3 years finally lifting off my chest. For the first time since I stood in the rain behind that diner holding a trash bag full of my clothes, I belonged exactly where I was.